Ellen Frost. I'm affiliated with the Peterson Institute and the National Defense University. In the spirit of Mr. Baru's comment about not looking just at the numbers, Peter, I wonder if you would look sort of qualitatively at China's consumption, putting aside for the moment the ratio to GDP. I have read that the Chinese government in Ashley's medium-term framework, 5 to 15 years, is really trying to take a number of steps to narrow the gap between the interior and the coast, between the country and the cities. Not just the agricultural tax changes, but things like lowering the down payment on mortgages, improving health care, pensions, and so forth, so that the poverty relief can advance and social stability, presumably, can be improved. But I have no way of judging how likely that is, since so many of these decisions are in the hands of local officials. And I don't know whether or not these measures are likely to bear fruit. So I wondered if you could just give us your impression of what you think will happen there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I'll gladly do so. The main point of my analysis was that there is a consumption problem, there is a demand problem, and a supply problem. Of those two, supply problem is much more difficult. And basically, the consumption problem in China is not because consumption is growing slowly. It's because GDP was growing more slowly, even faster. Now, the government has been making the right kind of noises about the need to increase consumption growth even faster, and they are actually doing that, both at the household consumption level and government consumption. Government consumption is being promoted through additional spending on the social sectors. The increases in the budget outlays for healthcare, for social security, safety nets, and to a lesser extent education are quite impressive. There are very few countries, and they're still inadequate, but there are very few countries where the rate of increase in social spending through the budget is higher than in China as of the last 12, 24 months. So that's on the government side. On the household consumption side, they are indeed, of course, promoting home ownership. China has now, in the urban areas, a higher home ownership rate than even the United States. It's over 75%. The mortgage market has all developed in the last 10 years, didn't exist. The entire urban housing sector was privatized in China. Starting in '89 under Chu Rongji was another major structural reform which promoted consumption in the form of purchase of house improvement, curtains, floors, for better windows, doors, and so on. But in addition to that, as of March of this year, they've been given a 13% budget finance price subsidy to a very wide range of consumer durables, from tractors to TV screens. And initially, that was reserved for rural areas. They later on rolled it out to entire China. So here you have a country concerned about inadequate consumption growth that gives a 13% price subsidy on a wide range of consumer durables. I don't know of another country in the world where you have that kind of thing. And they're financing it from the budget. So I'm not so worried about the consumption. They know the problem. It isn't slow at all. And they're doing something to further accelerate it. So I'm worried about the supply side.
Yes. My name is Amitav Acharya from American University. Question to Sanjay Baru. You said you spent the year in Singapore listening to a lot of seminars where people are congratulating themselves for having done well in terms of ensuring state intervention, the kind of state intervention that was beneficial. But I just wonder, what were they congratulating themselves about? I mean, Singapore had the worst recession in its post-independence history. I mean, Malaysia, Thailand, although it's not directly related to the economic crisis, but didn't have a very good political situation at home. And of course, only Indonesia seemed to be the good news. But in the beginning, it was also under trouble. So the question is, maybe you were in the Lee Kuan Yew school, so I had too much of Kishore. But what I'm talking about is the whole idea. I mean, you look at the Dwight Perkins chapter in this in your report, which I haven't read, but he does say that Southeast Asian economies have been hit hard by the global economic crisis. And certainly, even though some of the countries are rebounding, but there should be some lessons. So are they learning any lessons or simply congratulating themselves? Secondly, a question quickly about India. And you said that India is not very enthusiastic about regional financial cooperation. Well, there's a pretty good reason for it, because India is pretty marginal to East Asian regional cooperation, whether it's trade or finance. It's a late comer to the game, and its entry into, it's not even a member of APEC, and its entry into East Asian community was kind of an accident. Was not because of Indian initiative, but because it was a question of balancing Chinese influence on the East Asian summit. So obviously India is not very keen, but should it be keen? I mean, that's the question is, should India actually look at East Asia? As you said, the Indian economy is increasingly dependent on China, and India is increasingly integrated into East Asia. So shouldn't it be time for India to actually want to play a more important role, active role in East Asian regionalism?
No, you're right that the region was hit. I don't think the argument in the region is that they were not hit. The argument is that they were able to recover more rapidly than most people expected them to. Certainly in Singapore, for instance, the view there is that we were prepared for a shock, and we were spent so much money. The treasury view in Singapore is that we accumulate surplus in the upturn and then spend it in the downturn. So we had the money to spend, and we are smart guys. You may disagree with that, but I'm just telling you this is the view that governments in the region, Malaysia, in Singapore, that the governments in the region were proactive and reacted quickly and therefore minimized the impact of the crisis. I don't think they're congratulating themselves for having escaped the impact, but that they're able to manage the impact. On the second question about India and the region, India has no option but to be more and more integrated with the region. It is not true that we were invited into the region. We in fact, proactively sought engagement in the region. The Look East policy was launched in 1992 by the Narasimha Rao government as a considered response to the end of the Cold War. Indian foreign policy changed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And two consequences of that, the end of the Cold War, was a fundamental change in our attitude towards the United States and Israel, and a fundamental change in our attitude to Southeast Asia. And this was a conscious policy decision of the Indian strategic establishment to engage, on the one hand, the US, and on the other hand, Southeast Asia. We sought membership of the ASEAN Regional Forum. We sought dialogue partnership with the ASEAN. We have increasingly become active with the region. As a consequence, Asia has emerged as the largest, East Asia, Southeast Asia have together emerged as our largest trade partners. China today is India's biggest trade partner, but Japan, Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia are all important trade partners. Secondly, you look in terms of people flow. There's increasing out-migration into the region of professionals who are welcomed. Countries have changed their attitudes. There's a lot of tension between diasporic Indian communities and ethnically local communities, and most visibly in Malaysia. But the new government in Malaysia, as you probably know, has changed its policy, its Bhumiputra policy, to accommodate Indian professionals, because they recognize that these are skilled workers in the service sector, and they have contributed to India's success, and they would like to bring many of them into Kuala Lumpur, into Jakarta, into Indonesia, and so on and so forth. So India's integration into Southeast Asia is a fact of life. It has moved apace. I remember I wrote a paper on India and ASEAN in 1998 or 99, and Steve Cohen, when he wrote his book, India, the Emerging Power, referred to it almost in, kind of saying that, Sanjay Baru talks about his Look East policy, but, I don't know what he's talking about. So he dismissed their argument in as recently as 99 or 2000. If you see his chapter on India and East Asia. But he was wrong. I was right. Just look at the numbers. Our level of integration into the region has increased phenomenally. But despite that, and part of the reason, of course, is that the region has become more welcoming of India. I used to travel into Southeast Asia in the early 90s when nobody was interested in India. Even Korea, there was zero investment from Korea in 1992 in India. 92. I went to Korea for the first time in 92 and they were not interested. Today, Korea has become the largest investor. You come to India, you'll see on the streets LG, Samsung, Hyundai. They dominate markets, automobile market, television market, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, etc. So there has been a fundamental change in the level of integration between India. And the reason is that many of those countries actually seek India's greater engagement in the region. You are absolutely right that one important factor is that they seek balancing of China's rising influence. Lee Kuan Yew has been explicit. You read Lee Kuan Yew's essays. He has written many essays. He's given lectures all over the world saying that Singapore seeks a balance between India and China and Asia. And Singapore is a Chinese ethnic Chinese community, but the feeling is even stronger in Indonesia and in Malaysia and in Vietnam that they are concerned about rising Chinese power, and they would like to see a more active and economically stronger India to balance that in the region. I think that is quite obvious. I don't think there's I have no doubt at all in my mind that is in fact today the case. Whether we succeed is up to us. Whether we actually rise to the expectations and meet the expectations will depend on our ability to sustain 9-10% growth in the next decade. We have to catch up with China. We lag behind China. There's no question about it. On the manufacturing sector particularly, I do, on the other hand, believe that in the financial sector, we are stronger than China. I think I'm not very confident about the comment about the strength of the Chinese banking system. I think the question marks, if you talk to analysts about the health of the Chinese financial sector, certainly the Indian financial sector is much healthier. But on the manufacturing side, no question about it. The Chinese are far ahead, productivity levels are higher, technological change is faster. So we have to catch up. But the region wants us to catch up. I think this is the first time you see a change in attitudes. I hope that answers your question.
We just add one thought on the first issue, which is the question of what are the Southeast Asians congratulating themselves. There was a series of pieces that Kishore Mahbubani did in the immediate aftermath of the crisis that basically identified what he thought was the success. And if I read him right, his argument essentially was that there is an Asian style of capitalism which focuses on what you would think of as Asian values, whatever that means. But in terms of examples, he was talking of frugality, emphasis on education, living within one's means, etc., etc., etc. And I think his argument at least was, it is the pursuit of these values consistently that permitted them, guided of course by a benevolent state, etc., etc., that permitted them to deal with this crisis better than those of us in the West who.
Incidentally, I don't entirely agree with a lot of what Kishore writes. I certainly don't agree with his view about the West and the East. Since he was my paymaster for a year, I don't want to disagree with him in a Washington audience. I've done that in the Singapore audience.
Alyssa, please.
And I'm with McLarty Associates. I also have a question for Dr. Baru. I'm sorry I don't have a question about China. I don't want you to feel left out here. But if I could ask you to follow up a bit on the way you framed your presentation. In particular, you said something about that nervousness has political consequences. Can I ask you to put that sort of in the context of what you see happening now with India and the economic reforms process? There's now the return of the UPA government with a stronger mandate. But is there a sense, and I think I might have heard you imply that perhaps people are going to go slower on the reforms, even though they may have wanted to use the political mandate to move faster, precisely because of this nervousness. Is that what you intended to convey?
Partly, yes. I think governments tend to be nervous in terms of their domestic policies. But I also was referring to nervousness in dealing with other powers. For instance, after the Depression, all of Europe was so nervous that they did not confront Hitler till he landed at their doorstep. Literally, not one European country had the courage to. I don't know if you've read my friend Kazuo Ishiguro's book, Remains of the Day. It's a fascinating book, right? You see those discussions, all those rich British bankers meeting in a manor in England, not wanting to confront Hitler because they were all worried about their bottom lines. So nervousness internationally also in dealing with countries. I think I'm talking of both.
Thank you. This question is related to both China and India. I'd like to address, to look into, in terms of regional integration, in terms of the region of Central Asia and South Asia, that axis, and in particular, the role of China and India in related to this issue of security and stability in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But actually Tellis is obviously an expert in that, but from an economic perspective, looking at a broader issue of eventually the global epicenter, economic epicenter of the entire world is shifting from the West because of China and India and coming to this neighborhood. What implications that has in terms of looking at the stability of this region from a Central Asia, South Asia axis, and obviously China is already the single largest investor in Afghanistan, and I believe the single largest investor in Pakistan. And India obviously has enormous interest, not only because of terrorism, but because of its own security interests with its neighbor, but as well because of its needs for energy resources, obviously, that it can tap in the Central Asia. So the role of China and India from a security stability relationship in regards to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and its relationship with the U.S. and NATO and Europe.
Well, I think you raised enough questions for a seminar of 24 hours. First, allow me to make some comments on India-China. This is a bilateral relationship of enormous importance now. It wasn't in the past. There was hardly any trade between the two countries 20 years ago. As you heard my colleague say, today China is India's largest trading partner. Who would have thought that 15 years ago? That has gone so fast. But and I think for stability in Asia, for these two giants to find a way to tolerate each other and to develop somewhat more constructive relations than they may have had in the past is extremely important. My sense, I know China better than I do India, is that both sides are extremely keenly aware of the importance of their bilateral relationship, but also of their cultural, historic, psychological, political differences. That two countries couldn't be more different than India and China. Yet both sides, in my sense, are absolutely determined to avoid getting on a negative, slippery slope, because they know once you are on that slope, there's no end to it. They may not like each other, they may not have a sort of a friendship in mind, but both sides are keenly aware of the critical importance for stability in Asia, stability in the world, of a constructive bilateral relationship. On the economic side, of course, you have already pointed to some key aspects, key dimensions of what's going on. India's economic emergence, which started in a hurry in the early 90s under Manmohan Singh as finance minister at that time, of course, promises that India will become a very, very significant economic player, not only in Asia, but also in the global economy, even though China may continue to be ahead of India. But there's no question that India is going to be an enormously important power on the world. And the first effects, I think, that we have to look at are the intra-Asia relationships. As was pointed out, intra-Asia trade is now far more important than Asia trade with the United States or with Europe. That's the fastest growing part of global trade, is intra-Asia trade. China last year became the largest exporter in the world in gross terms, overtaking Germany. It already became the largest trader, imports plus exports, in 2007, replacing the United States, and that's going forward. If we assume that current trends continue, which is, of course, a wild assumption in terms of GDP growth, China's economy will be equal on market prices, assuming no real significant changes in the market exchange rate, in about 20 years. That's shocking when you realize that it will take as little as 2 decades. What is even more shocking to realize, if those same trends continue for another 10 years, China's economy will be equal to that of the US plus Europe. That's what, almost beyond our comprehension, but that's what current trends suggest. And India, of course, is behind China in many aspects, and I actually agree with my colleague here on the development of India's financial sector. It is much more sophisticated than in China, but I don't think it's stronger than in China, but we can talk about that separately. Where India has gone way ahead of China is in private corporate development. China doesn't have many large, significant private corporations. They have large corporations, large banks, but they're all state-owned, majority state-owned and or state-controlled. But the shift, the gravity shift in the world from the transatlantic economy to the trans-Pacific economy, and particularly the East Asian economy, is one of the great geopolitical changes of our age.
I entirely agree with whatever is just said about China and India and the region, and I share, so I won't repeat all that. Just very briefly focus on specific question of Afghanistan, Pakistan. I actually believe that today, given what is happening in the region, the United States, Russia, China, and India have all a shared objective. I think the time has come for these 4 powers to actually sit together and work out a strategy for dealing with the problem in Afghanistan. Because what we are fighting in Afghanistan is for a liberal, plural, democratic Islamic society against a conservative, radical, extremist theology. And no other country is more concerned about this than Pakistan itself, which wants to be a democracy where there is a growing middle class today in Pakistan, not the old feudal lords, not the army generals, but a new middle class. Kids want to have fun, they want to go partying like kids around the world, young people who want to live in a modern world. And that's a sentiment in the streets of Kuala Lumpur or Jakarta, in the Islamic world as a whole. They don't want to become victims of jihadis who will come and kill you if you don't wear a parda, and who don't want women to be educated, etc. So there is a major ideological battle between conservative, radical, or extremist groups and normal people who want to live like all of us, normal lives, and have a good life and enjoy the good life, where women seek equality with men, etc. That's an ideological battle in which China, Russia, United States, India, we are all on the same side, and Pakistan, we are all on the same side. And it's quite clear that no one country has a solution in Afghanistan. The British didn't have it, the Russians didn't have it, the Americans today are arguing among yourselves. I read the editorial yesterday in Washington Post. There's a debate going on here. You can't simply walk out and allow the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda to win. But at the same time, you can't do it on your own. And I think the time has really come for all of us to come together and work with countries in the region to build a democratic society in Afghanistan, which is plural, secular, and modern. And if we opt out of that, as a result of the global economic crisis, then I would say this is the second big mistake. It's the same kind of nervousness that I was talking about earlier in the interwar period. Countries opted out of taking on Hitler till Hitler landed at their doorstep. And here, if we opt out even after they landed at your doorstep, which they did on 9/11, you can't opt out of this. You got to win this battle.
Well, let me thank Sanjay and Peter for a very interesting and very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you very much.